Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with Jacob Soboroff in conversation with Alicia Menendez discussing Separated Inside an American Tragedy. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, you can click the like button, and it'll bump it up in the queue, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation in the chat area to the right. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website by signing up for our email newsletter. You can follow us on social media at BookSoup, and you can also follow us right here on our Crowdcast page to receive direct notifications. And you can also watch past events on our YouTube channel. Please support. If you got a ticket tonight with a book, thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores. If you got the free ticket, then I encourage you to please support BookSoup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. You can do that by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen, and it'll redirect you to our website where you can complete the checkout process. We do have signed copies of Separated, so take advantage while we have them. We may be able to get more if we run out of stock of that, but don't let that stop you from buying a copy. So we're also open for in-store browsing. So if you're local to Los Angeles, please stop by daily, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., and we would love to see you. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. Jacob Soboroff is a correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. For his reporting on the child separation policy, he received the 2019 Walter Cronkite Award for Individual Achievement by a national journalist and the 2019 Hillman Prize for Broadcast Journalism. He has appeared on Today, Morning Joe, The Rachel Maddow Show, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and numerous other programs. He co-presented with Katie Tur the 4-part docuseries American Swamp on MSNBC, and he lives in Los Angeles. Alicia Menendez is the host of American Voices on MSNBC and host of the Latina to Latina podcast, and the author of The Likeability Trap, How to Break Free and Succeed as You Are, which I will also share a link to in the chat area right now, so you can also support Alicia's book. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Jacob and Alicia. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. And everyone, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Jacob.
Hi, Alicia. We do this in just everybody who's here. This is like what we normally do. Me and Alicia just chat on video, hanging out.
And since we've had a chance to do it on so many occasions, Jacob, I'm just going to remind everyone who's watching that I would love for them to send in their questions and their comments, because I have had plenty of opportunities to read the book, to ask Jacob my questions about it. So I welcome yours, especially Mama Soboroff, since you have taken the time to be here. Yeah, hi, Patty. I look forward to your critique of this presentation. We're sort of there's levity in this moment, but we're talking about the most serious of topics, Jacob. And I remember your original reporting on this and watching you do it and saying, I'm not entirely sure how he's keeping it together, because, we're both parents. And so this just hits really different when you're a parent. Take me back to how this story ended up on your radar.
Yeah. And thanks for doing this. And thanks to BookSoup for doing this. I love BookSoup. If you're here and you've never been to BookSoup, you should go check out BookSoup. It's one of my favorite bookstores in LA, and I'm really grateful that they agreed to do this, especially a year after the original book came out for the paperback, and that they're still talking about and amplifying this story, which is the systematic separation of thousands of children, 5,500 approximately, according to now the Biden administration, but previously the ACLU. And the Trump administration disagreed with those numbers. Children from their parents deliberately. What you've heard me say before, Physicians for Human Rights now says meets the United Nations definition of torture. The American Academy of Pediatrics, Colleen Kraft at the time, the president said was government-sanctioned child abuse. And it didn't have to happen. It happened because the Trump administration and Stephen Miller in particular, and a whole host of characters wanted to do this to continue a decades-long deterrence-based policy of the United States government, Democratic and Republican, that basically saw its worst form ever in the separation policy. And the truth of the matter is, as I read at the beginning of the book, I was an unlikely eyewitness to what I think will become one of the most shameful chapters in modern American history. And the reason I say unlikely, Alicia, is because I didn't I had no idea. I fancied myself a border correspondent. I fancied myself somebody who lived proximate in Los Angeles to border-related issues, whether they were the drugs or the MS-13 conversation that the president was having at the time, or you name it. And so I sort of thought, I get what's happening at the border. I was even working on a Dateline documentary about the reality of life along the border. And as we were doing this over 2017 and 2018, I just missed what so many actually advocates and attorneys and also other journalists like Julia Ainsley, our colleague, and Caitlin Dickerson, who was at the New York Times at the time, Lomi Creel, who was at the Houston Chronicle at the time, and I could go on and on, did know what was happening, that they were contemplating doing something that the Obama administration rejected out of hand, that the Trump administration started talking about in the earliest days. And not until I was invited, very long story short, and you can read all about how I ultimately made my way there in the book, not until I was invited there by a woman named Katie Waldman, who was the press deputy to Kirstjen Nielsen, the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time. She's now Katie Miller, the wife of Stephen Miller. Did I get invited inside of these two facilities at the epicenter because they wanted the world to see it. They wanted the world to understand the cruelty of the policy. And in a way, I and the other journalists there were sort of used to put those images out there of kids, what today is very familiar with kids in those cage cells in the McAllen Border Patrol Processing Center, the children living for 22 hours a day in the Walmart at Casa Padre in Brownsville, Texas. And so I know this is a long answer to your question, but the bottom line is I had no idea the family separations were happening. And I, in retrospect, probably was not the most ideal person to tell the story. I just happened to be there. And so I did what I know how to do, which is talk to the audience about what I was seeing and experiencing firsthand and share my observations. And that just happened to be a moment in which the nation was tuned in and the conversation really continued from there about what was happening. And it was only 10 days after those initial reports that the Trump administration stopped the policy, or at least said they were going to stop the policy.
What did you learn as you began to report about how that policy came to be?
That it wasn't a new idea.
That's one of the most fascinating parts of the book to me, and it comes pretty early on when you talk about the fact that this was floated in meetings in the Obama administration.
Including meetings that Alejandro Mayorkas, the current Secretary of Homeland Security, was present for, that Jay Johnson, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, told me directly, and I write about, our on-the-record conversation in the book, that this was something that basically made its way to the top levels of the Department of Homeland Security. Cecilia Munoz, who was a top policy advisor at the time, also acknowledged that this was something that was floated, and they rejected it. And they rejected it because the obvious reason: why would you want to take a child away from their parent in order to basically harm them for life? I mean, one of the officials that I talked to in the book talks about how it ended up being the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of his lifetime, working in domestic political affairs. It didn't have to happen. And so once the Trump administration came in, it was within, I think, a month of the inauguration, Valentine's Day 2017, there was a meeting at DHS where there were some Obama holdovers and there were some Trump holdovers. It was in the conference room of Kevin McAleenan, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time. I'm sorry, the head of Customs and Border Protection later became the Secretary of Homeland Security, and they sort of said, do we want to do this? And it was an idea that from that point on continued to get more and more of a hearing within the administration, to the point where in March of 2017, John Kelly, who was then the Secretary of Homeland Security, later became the Chief of Staff, acknowledged on CNN to Wolf Blitzer that, they were going to consider, to deter people from coming to the United States, this idea of separating parents from children by using not necessarily prosecutions. And that's actually one of the things in the afterword that I write about, by just separating everybody. And it could have ultimately been far worse than it was. And that's one of the things actually in between the time I wrote the original, the hardcover and the paperback, that I learned about how much worse this actually could have been. And not to say that it wasn't, by the way, like I said, one of the worst things the United States government has ever done to anybody. When we talk about 5,500 children who they're now trying to track down and find and reunite, it could have been 100,000. if they did what they wanted to do, which was separate every parent and children who came into the country without even charging them with a crime.
One of the things that I think is most mind-boggling, aside from the fact that this happened, is the fact that they didn't have any plan to track these children and to reunite them. I mean, this isn't just like sloppy bureaucracy. It was willful disregard for the lives of these children and these parents. Yeah,
I think negligence, extreme negligence at best case scenario. The worst case scenario is deliberate or torture, to use the Physicians for Human Rights characterization. And there are many stories in the book that really make this clear, but for me, none more than Scott Lloyd, who was the head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the time, the agency that's responsible for placing unaccompanied migrant children into shelters and then take them on to a sponsor, generally a family member living in the country. Might be a parent that was already here or a cousin or distant relative. And Scott Lloyd, when Caitlin Dickerson broke the story that there was an unofficial list, to your point, there was no plan, so they were keeping an unofficial list once they heard of this, of separations happening. These are the dedicated career civil servants who I really think are the heroes in all of this. They heard that the separations were happening. One guy, Jim De La Cruz, is keeping this basically spreadsheet of separations that they're hearing about that are happening. And basically the conversation happens between Scott Lloyd and Katie Miller, about like, how in the F did this leak to the New York Times, that this secret policy of separations is now out there, and the public knows there are 700 parents and children separated from one another, and this is around the spring of 2018. This is after a whole pilot program in the El Paso sector and in other areas along the border. This is when they really started to scale this thing up in the hopes that they could do this border wide and separate as many parents from children as possible. Because, and I just want to mention his name again, President Trump was just relentless about looking at the numbers, thinking the numbers were too high of people crossing, and he saw them as numbers, not as human beings, and said, we got to do something about this. Let's do this separation thing. And so Scott Lloyd wanted to get rid of the list.
Just to be clear, with the theory being that parents in home countries were going to hear what was happening at the border, and it would deter them from making the same decision and crossing together as families.
Yeah, it would scare them shitless, frankly, from coming to the United States. And, this is a whole nother conversation that I think is important to have and point out. I'll get back to Scott Lloyd, but that deterrence has always been, in the modern era of immigration policy and enforcement, the policy of the U.S. government. Bill Clinton built the first wave of walls. We've talked about this. George W. Bush created DHS in the wake of 9/11 and exponentially increased the size of the Border Patrol. Barack Obama deported using interior enforcement, ICE, more people than any president in the history of the United States, all in the name of deterrence. And even today, the Biden administration, a senior administration official said to me the other day, and I wrote about this on MSNBC.com, that they still need to, quote unquote, deter irregular migration while creating what they say is a fair and safe and humane and orderly system in the wake of the Trump administration policy. Deterrence has been, always will be, unless something drastic changes, part of immigration policy. The Trump administration said, okay, we're going to deter by just doing abject cruelty, to use Adam Serwer's, the cruelty is the point. The cruelty was the point here. And so Scott Lloyd, whether or not he intended to be cruel or was negligent, what we were just talking about, said in reaction to this article coming out, let's get rid of the list. And when my book came out initially, he acknowledged that. He said, I briefly considered it, and ultimately he decided not to do that. But the point is that this guy who was the custodian of thousands of children in the custody of the U.S. government basically said, I think in reaction to the policy leaking, maybe we just need to put this on the hush hush. That's my characterization of it. He can make his own characterization of it. And that led to one of these officials, as I write in the book, saying that this guy is one of the most prolific child abusers in modern American history for those acts taken. And then this sort of plays out all across the whole of U.S. government. In Health and Human Services, there's stories like this. In the Department of Homeland Security, there's the debate between Kirstjen Nielsen and McAleenan and pressure from the White House about signing the decision memo that would expand the policy. And then the Department of Justice as well. And that was something that came out after the book initially came out, and I read about it afterward also, that they had these meetings, including in the White House Situation Room, where top officials from the Justice Department said, Jeff Sessions reportedly said, we have to take away the children. And Stephen Miller called for a show of hands vote in the Situation Room with moving forward with this policy. So it's whether or not it's negligence, I guess, will be up to whether or not they do a thorough investigation, as President Biden has promised, or whether or not it was just, or whether it was true cruelty in the truest sense. And the evidence, in my opinion, indicates that it was the latter, knowing everything I know about what it took to do this, and talking to the families that went through it, basically what the experience was for them.
Just want to remind everyone who's here that we're about a third of the way through our conversation. And I know that as much as Jacob wants to hear my question, he wants to hear yours. So if you haven't already, this is Jacob and I going back to our journalistic roots at HuffPost Live. Feel free to drop a question in there and I'll make sure that I get it.
This isn't a beer. This is a sparkling water.
Sparkling water, good.
Cheers.
Jacob, would you talk specifically about the role that Stephen Miller played in pushing all of this through and the way that fit into a bigger ethos on the part of Miller and how it influenced the Trump administration overall?
I think he was the architect of this policy. When you talk to, as I mentioned, like across the government, this was a person who was reaching out on the side to career level civil servants and political appointees about this policy and other policies in order to implement. Go read Jean Guerrero's book. I know you have, but stuff rooted in white nationalist ideology. And don't take my word for it. There are emails, which I think I cited in the book, that also exist in the public record of Stephen Miller and Scott Lloyd, for instance, emailing back and forth. What is a top advisor to the president of the United States directly emailing outside the chain of command the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, if not to influence the policies and the practices of the department? And the career people will tell you that's what they were contending with. There are normal ways that these systems are supposed to function. You have a Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, at the time. By the way, many of these people ended up being at the center of COVID. You know, it's like, for something that was the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the lifetime of one official at the center of this, then these are the same people that are put in charge of managing and mitigating a once-in-a-century pandemic, global pandemic. And Stephen Miller is at the center of all of that. And like I said, his wife is then, well, actually, they fell in love during the separation policy. I mean, that's not an exaggeration to say they started dating.
And is one of the most shocking exchanges in the book.
Yeah, and it's like I say it now almost because I'm so familiar with it. It is, I mean, just think about that for a second, you know. And some of the stuff that she said to me, which got a lot of attention initially when the book came out, sort of gets at the heart of who they are as a couple and the way that they think and the way that this policy came to be. She, myself, and Katie Tur, another colleague of ours, went to dinner around the time American Swamp was mentioned at the beginning of this, around the time we were shooting this documentary series, American Swamp. And in DC, she was sort of talking to Katie about the separation policy. And she was saying to Katie, something that she had said to me previously, that they sent her to the border to be, this is Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's then girlfriend, soon to be wife, maybe even not fiance at the time. They sent me to the border to be more compassionate. It did not work. To which I replied to her, and you could read the whole exchange in the book. I basically said, I don't know how you feel that way. I saw this and I think it's changed me forever. Are you a white nationalist? And I said at point blank, not joking or whatever. I just said, like, this is crazy that you talk this way. And she said, no, but, which is not generally how someone would respond if asked, are you a white nationalist? But I believe if you come to America, you shouldn't have to assimilate. Why do we have a little Havana? And this is someone who grew up and lived in South Florida and knows obviously the importance of little Havana to South Florida, politically, culturally, economically, you name it. And she still felt that way. And she didn't feel like it was something that she wanted to hide or felt like it was a secret, didn't say this is an off the record comment. This was a statement to two journalists by a senior person in the Trump Homeland Security Department, who was at the center of this policy. And then the significant other of the top advisor to the president of the United States. And so for me, if you want to understand Stephen Miller, look at Katie Miller's role in this as well. She, and it's been described to me as by people close to Kirstjen Nielsen, that she was almost like a mole, not to excuse Kirstjen Nielsen, by the way, who signed the decision memo to make this possible, but a mole for the White House within the Homeland Security Department, being able to report back to Stephen what the secretary herself was doing and saying and thinking about this policy.
I, as you know, interviewed one of the first families to be reunited in the wake of the Biden administration. And I've thought about this a lot from the vantage point of the children who were separated. I had not thought as much, admittedly, prior to interviewing this woman about what the experience was for the parents who got separated and the way, in many ways, they became activated. So this one mom talks, for example, about, being separated from her children. They didn't explain to her what was happening. They didn't explain to her when she would be reunited with her kids. And then she's in a separate holding facility, and all of a sudden she starts seeing other moms who are showing up who are hysterical. And she begins asking them, what happened to you? Did they take your kids away too? And she begins maintaining her own list, because she has the foresight to realize if they were cruel enough to separate us from our kids, then the likelihood is they're not capturing all of this information. And so she, in as much as she was living through it, also became a witness to the horrors of what was being done to other families. So often when we tell the story, it's easy to tell it as though these migrants had no agency, but yet a lot of the families that I've spoken with, they have navigated incredibly complex systems with the help of attorneys, but they have done a lot of the legwork themselves to be reunited with their kids.
It gave me the chills just hearing you describe that, and I recall that interview, and it was an excellent interview, and I think people should go watch it if they're interested in what the life after separation is like for many of these families and the struggle to ultimately get back together. But it made me think, actually, her keeping of the list reminded me of Juan, who's the not his real name, but the name he asked me to use, the father and whose son, Jose. They were separated for 5 months, and he ended up in the Adelanto ICE detention center 2 hours outside of LA. I had no idea that there wasn't one of the biggest in the country at 2 hours outside of LA. It was like less, and I could drive up there. And basically what happened was I was introduced to him by an attorney who found out that there were 12 fathers who had been separated and coerced into signing away the right to reunite with their children and were on the verge of being deported. And they had found out from each other that they were all in the same situation as they were detained there. And so I don't know if they made an explicit list, but once one of the attorneys was able to go into the interview room where I actually sat myself to meet Juan, they started talking and said, there are other people like us here. And we've been talking, and all of us have been coerced into signing away the right. And was it not for their fight, to your point, yes, the attorneys were the ones who, I do think are as important as any first responder on any front line, as I write in the book. And I've come to really get to know some incredible immigration attorneys and activists who fought for these folks. Without them making people aware on the outside that they were on the inside, many of the reunifications that happened, you say early, but 5 months is not early. That is a lifetime. Every day, the trauma compounds. A lot of those early reunifications, there's still over 1,000 that have yet to happen, probably wouldn't have happened. And Juan himself probably would have been deported back to Petén, Guatemala, where he fled in the first place under the threat of violence. And his son probably would have been left in the United States to fend for themselves. And they're now back together, and I've seen them a handful of times since they were reunited. And I first met the father inside that detention center where he, again, to your point, banded together with the others who were separated. And it was a similar version of the story when they were at the Border Patrol Center before they were sent to ICE and the son was sent to HHS, where they all just started talking to each other, and they couldn't see each other. They didn't know. This was the first time many of them were on airplanes or in shackles on buses. They had to figure it out themselves. And that's what I hope, actually, is that one day, in some way, the book and the reporting has gotten a fair amount of attention, but I hope that it won't be necessary, and that the children who want to tell their stories, there will be 5,500 plus stories that, like the Shoah Foundation for Victims of the Holocaust. I hope that there will be a collection or an oral history or something where these stories are told by the people that went through them, if they so choose themselves, because that truly is the only way that you will really be able to understand the magnitude of what people went through, and the fact that people are still separated to this day, which is mind-blowing. Some
right.
maybe
even the families that have been reunified, I mean, they're in a state of legal limbo. This is a temporary status that we
don't even know that they're going to be able to stay. Yeah, and there's a lot on the Biden administration too. The Biden administration, President Biden promised he not only said that it was criminal in the final debate when another colleague of ours, Kristen Welker, asked him about, at the time, the 545 kids whose parents couldn't be located. This was, I guess, the late fall of 2020. But he also said to Jeff Bennett, yet another colleague of ours, that and credit to all of our colleagues for staying on this story so intensely. He told Jeff that there was going to be, quote unquote, a thorough investigation when he was president-elect of the United States. And there was a great piece in Slate today by Kerry Kennedy and Erica Andiola about basically, where's the investigation? All the people who were part of this policy have landed on their feet, I think was the headline of the article. And there's no sign of any investigation by Justice Department or otherwise. There's a reunification effort. And I've talked to Secretary Mayorkas twice about this, and he insists they're going to do the reunification part of this first and then get to the accountability portion of it. But as many of the activists, including El Ultralado, who has fought diligently for many of their initial group of reunified families, justice is not just reunification. That's the beginning of a really, really, really tough process for these families, which needs to include mental health services that Seneca Family of Agency is providing, and all kinds of other legal services from KIND and Women's Refugee Commission and Justice in Motion, who's searching for people on the ground in Central America.
Talk to me about that piece, because that, I think, when you say that there are over 1,000 that are still not reunified, in as much as we can talk about how there was no process, I mean, you still hear that number and it's hard not to think, how could that be? And what do the efforts look like? I mean, the way you've described it to me, it is people going door to door, sharing information. Quite
literally. And I went with them. I went with the Seneca folks domestically searching. And this is actually, I just saw a question from Pam, which is, I just want to bring it up because it's relevant to this topic. She said, how many locations are these children at? At one time, I thought they were put on some military bases with our military having to babysit. There were. So the answer is they were spread out. The children who were separated were spread out all over the country in the dozens of shelters operated by Health and Human Services for what are ostensibly unaccompanied children who come to the country without a parent, and who are, in the words of Chris Hayes, rendered unaccompanied by the U.S. government, basically stolen away from their parents and became unaccompanied kids and put into the system. Today, I think 0 of those children are inside the system still. But to your point, Alicia, they're basically spread out all over the United States, most of them. Some of their parents are here domestically, but the vast majority of the parents have been deported, are like Juan, but didn't get the help of an attorney at the time to be able to stay here domestically and fight for their asylum cases together in the U.S. And so there are kids living. I talked to one child who, and what's so crazy is many of these kids came here not speaking a word of English, have gone into the American education system, speak perfect English now, and their parents are back in Honduras, for instance. There was a father and son that I talked to, and the kid came here when he was 4, 5, or 6, and now is excelling in school. And that story repeats itself all across the country. And what was crazy to do with the Seneca people is see what happens when someone knocks on the door and says, basically, and they'd have to try not to scare them because who knows if it's the government showing up or what. We know what happened to you. You're entitled and you have the right to mental health counseling. And if you're not reunited, to be reunited with your family. Here's a phone number, call us if you want help. And that has to happen now, whether it's in the US, all over the country. So the families that have been separated, I've met families from California, to New York, to Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. I think they're virtually in every state. And the challenge is now, where are the parents? And most of them are outside of the country. And so that's a whole nother effort that Justice is in Motion is undertaking to literally, as you said, go door to door. Kevin Seif of the Washington Post wrote a good article about a lawyer in Central America who's literally riding his motorbike around rural communities in order to find some of the parents and let them know that under the Biden administration and this task force, they have the right at least to come back for 36 months to be reunited with their family.
I want to ask this question from Ismail Perez, who's saying hi from Chicago and is asking you to describe the feelings that came over you the first time you saw the children at the facility. How long did those feelings stay with you?
Sick. I felt sick. And I said it on TV that night to Chris. I talked to Chris. You know this, like in our business, generally when you're reporting from the field, they give you a short amount of time to talk about something and then they sort of send you on your way. And I came out just really honestly shell-shocked. I came out of the Casa Padre, former Walmart in Brownsville, 1,500 square feet, kids living inside, as I said, 22 or 23 hours a day in this whole little mini world. And it was like, I had reported from inside a prison and also from inside county jails. And the only thing I could say was, this place called a shelter, but these kids are effectively incarcerated. And Chris and I ended up talking, I think, for 7 or 8 minutes straight, in a way that I never had on television. And I was like in a state of shock, but I also felt ill. And it was weird as a reporter because you generally don't want to let people know that. But it was almost like I didn't have the ability to continue without communicating that. And I'll never forget actually some criticism that I got at the time. One of the program officers from that shelter said to me, smile at the kids, they feel like animals in cages being looked at. And there were no cages at that facility, but there were at the one in McAllen. And I thought that was so such a crazy thing for somebody to say. But then I sort of saw the living conditions, and there was a journalist on social media who basically said, well, essentially, this is a paraphrase, if I had a closer lived experience to the children, maybe I wouldn't have been so shocked by that. And maybe they were looking at us that way because we didn't look like them. And all of these things are going through my head. That was a tweet that I got that night. And I'm thinking, man, should I be the person who's here? I felt badly guilty about being there. I felt sick to my stomach about seeing children in this situation away from their parents. And then I just sort of felt, then I sort of went into this mode that I had that I is like a muscle memory from being a political advance person to Mayor Bloomberg and later to Howard Dean when he was running, to just treat Chris Hayes as my like boss, my principal politician, like as if I was talking to Mayor Bloomberg about what I saw inside some place before he was going to go in. And I had a blue notebook, which I write about in the book, and everything I wrote down in that book, because we weren't allowed to bring cameras in, I just regurgitated the best that I could. And I sort of did that for 2 or 3 days. And then finally, when I got home, and then got called back on Father's Day, I just, I wasn't really able to process those emotions until I got to New York about 10 days later. And I did. It was very emotional, as anybody would be. And by the way, don't feel bad for me. I'm a reporter who saw something that was really intense. 5,500 children went through something that they'll never get back for the rest of their lives. And I happen to just see them in that state. You know what I mean?
What did you learn once the book was closed? Like what has come to light in the time since the book was published? Yeah,
there were things it's just a short quote, but I always forget exactly the wording of it. What happened was I got a text from somebody. Actually, I haven't told the story in detail. I got a text from somebody saying that they wanted to talk to me. I got a bunch of missed calls and I didn't know who they were from. And finally I called this person back. This was right around the time that the initial book came out. And this person, once I got on the phone, this person said, you missed some things, some really important key events. And I was like, oh, F, like I just wrote a whole book about this. Like, what did I mess up? And the person actually wasn't calling me to tell me that I had screwed up details of the story, but they said there's such a big chunk of this which you don't know about, obviously, because you didn't write about it in the book. And that led me and Julia Ainsley just to report out that story about the Situation Room meeting and the fact that this could have been so much worse than it initially was. Again, not to discount what these 5,500 parents and kids went through, but that the Trump administration, not only when Kirstjen Nielsen refused to sign the memo that would expand this policy nationwide, it sort of sent Stephen Miller into a tizzy. And they gathered everybody in what's called a principals committee meeting in the Situation Room. All these people who deal with immigration were invited there, including people that I had never heard before associated with this. Mike Pompeo was invited. John Bolton was invited, if I recall correctly. Other top senior national security officials were invited. And then the people who you know, Alex Azar, Kirstjen Nielsen, et cetera. And that's when Miller said, this is un-American. We're either going to do this or we're not going to do this. And what he had wanted to do was do something called administrative separations that would have forget about charging people with a crime. And that's ultimately what happened. Kirstjen Nielsen got, and again, I don't say this to excuse her role in this, but basically bullied, according to my reporting, because she tried to delay signing the memo, bullied into signing it. Ultimately, she signed it. She's responsible. But signing the policy that was going to refer all the parents and kids who came for prosecution. And only because, actually, they didn't have the volume of space to prosecute every parent and child that came into the country was the number, only is not the right word, but was the number 5,500. And if Stephen Miller had his way, and basically what he was pushing for in that Situation Room meeting and up until that point was to do administrative separations where there were no charges, where every kid that came into the country was sent to Health and Human Services and every parent was sent to ICE. And it wasn't about prosecution. As a mechanism for separation, it was just about separation to separate. And that's what they wanted to do. And so when that person called me and said, you missed some things, it was basically the deliberations and the work of Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, Gene Hamilton, the people in the Justice Department to get this thing going as early as possible was why I largely omitted it, because the truth of the matter is that's not where I was sourced up, so to speak. I really talked to people from HHS and DHS and some Justice Department adjacent sources, but nobody on the level that we ultimately talked to once we reported this stuff out after the hardcover came out in July of last year. And so that's sort of the gist of the story I tell in the afterword, which was humbling. It's humbling as a reporter to have missed that, just as it was humbling to not know separations were happening in the first place. And just the absolute shock, which maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by, that how bad they wanted it to be,
How do you make sense of what we're seeing at the border today? I feel like my life is looking at charts and trying to understand who is coming, why they're coming, how many people are actually coming.
We talked about this just offline. There's a promise of a fair, safe, humane, orderly immigration system. They campaigned on and used, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but they very clearly used family separation as a closing argument. This was so horrible that we're going to completely transform the immigration system in the wake of this of this criminal policy, to use the word of the now president. And so, my question is, because what you're seeing now is, again, an influx of children. It's happened in the past. It hasn't happened at these levels, but it's happened in the past, and the circumstances are very clear. If you have ever been to Central America, like I went, and as I was writing the book, to see the poverty and the starvation and malnutrition, in addition to the violence and persecution that people face, climate change, etc. what does a fair, safe, orderly, humane immigration system look like? And if you thought, as I suspected, that it might be some version of no more detention of families writ large, maybe even no more ICE detention for children completely, a new system where kids were not sent to Health and Human Services for a particularly long time. I mean, again, I'm not a policymaker. I'm a reporter who's sort of seen what deterrence and what scaring people away from coming looks like. The bones of that system are basically still in place. And on top of that, some of the more restrictive policies of the Trump administration, including this Title 42 thing that we've talked a lot about in your show, is still in place. That's kicking migrants back into some of the same dangerous circumstances that they fled. They brought back or are amping up what's called expedited removal to quickly get people out of the country. And they say they want to give people who have a legitimate claim to asylum a fair shake, but everybody has the right to declare asylum. And so you got people really disappointed in that. Are they doing interior enforcement like Trump wanted to do? No, they're not. And they've sort of indicated that they're going to develop more policies to make sure that people who aren't sick or aren't part of families, et cetera, be caught up in that type of stuff. But the actual enforcement along the border and deterrence, even as a word used as part of immigration policy, it's still there. And that's what they're still using that language. And they used it with me, as I said at the top of this.
We have a few more minutes. So if you have questions for Jacob, please ask them now.
This is it. Otherwise, we got kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we got kids. There are a lot of people on Twitter. And there's also a link here to purchase a signed copy of Separated. It, in addition to being an incredibly powerful story, is also just a beautiful book. I think, we talked a little bit about accountability, Jacob, and that just goes back to the question of how we make sure this never happens again. And I think you're right. That part of that is sort of cultural record and making sure that these stories are captured and that the people whose stories these are to tell have the opportunity to tell them. When you talk to advocates, what would a full scope of accountability look like?
The question is whether or not members of the Trump administration can be held criminally liable for deliberately doing this. And I talked to some folks who, with knowledge of the way that the system works, put it that way, in confidence, who say it's a tough case. And I've talked to other folks who say, look at all of the evidence of how deliberate this was, and how could there not be something done? The article today even just said, look at all the people from the Justice Department that not only are getting good jobs, but some of them are still in career positions at the Justice Department. There hasn't been a full accounting, I think, is the point. And maybe there is no criminal charge that's ever filed against anybody for doing this. But I don't think all of the information, I'll put as much out there as I know. We've seen inspectors general reports from HHS, DHS, and DOJ about this, but we still don't know whether or not the Justice Department has actually looked into what has happened. And I think that until we know that, until the Justice Department says we looked into it, we opened a case, or we decided not to open a case, how could there actually be accountability? And I think, as I said earlier, and maybe it's a good thought to end on, it's like, for the families, justice is not just reunification. It's not just necessarily holding people responsible for doing what happened to them responsible. It's a lifetime of pain and suffering and trauma that they'll all have for the rest of their lives. And so, are they going to be compensated? Are they going to be able to stay in the country permanently? Right now, it's 36 months maximum, and then they can apply again to stay, being paroled into the country. And so there are still so many questions, which is why, I'm glad that we got to do this, which is why any opportunity I have, I continue to talk about this. And I'm going to continue to pursue projects that elevate this into this sort of as much as I can into the conversation in the way that I know how. And I hope other people do it too. And other people are. And I'll try to uplift those folks as much as I can as well.
All right, Jacob Soboroff, my friend, thank you so much.
So fun to do this with you. And I know it's a very serious topic, but I'm grateful to you for being here.
Yeah, no, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Please get your copy of Separated if you have not, or share it with a friend. If you have Ticket, you can rewatch this if you'd like, or share it with someone since it was free. I think that's okay. And thank you so much, Jacob and Alicia, for being with us. I know it's such an important topic, and really
thanks
hard.
Thanks to Book Soup. Yeah, no, thanks to Book Soup. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your night.
Take care, everybody.